Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. So today, we're going to talk about a case that's as disturbing as it is tragic. The story of two sisters who earned the nickname the Scissor Sisters after committing one of the most gruesome murders in Ireland's recent history. The Mulhall family lived in South Dublin. They were a big family, two parents, John and Kathleen, and their 6 kids, 3 boys, 3 girls. On the surface, it looked like any ordinary working class household, but behind closed doors, things were far from normal. The father, John Mulhall, was allegedly abusive not just sometimes, but throughout most of his marriage. And the children, including our 2 central figures, Linda and Charlotte, saw it all. They grew up surrounded by fear and violence, and it left its mark. Linda was the eldest of the 2 sisters. She was 9 years older than Charlotte. By the time all this happened, she was a mother of 4. But her life hadn't been easy. She dropped out of school young, became a mother in her teens, and never really found her footing. She struggled with addiction, alcohol, drugs for most of her adult life. Linda's first relationship ended quickly, and then she met a man named Wayne Kinsella, but he was far from a savior. Wayne abused all 4 of Linda's children while they lived together. And for a long time, Linda didn't stop him. Maybe she was too deep into her own addictions, too broken by her own past, or maybe it was fear. But she didn't call the police. She didn't report him. She just let it happen. Then one day, after a fight with Wayne, something in her snapped. Out of anger, maybe even guilt, she went to the police. She told them everything. Wayne was arrested and later sentenced to 6 years in prison, but her confession came at a cost. Social services took all 4 of her children away from her. After that, Linda spiraled. She fell into an even deeper depression. Her addiction got worse. She was completely lost. But strangely enough, she did manage to pull herself back, little by little. She eventually moved back in with her family. She got her kids back. And although she wasn't totally sober, she had things more under control than ever before. By the time the murder happened, she was a far cry from who she used to be. Now just for a moment, let's step away from the main story and talk about Wayne Kinsella. Because even though he's not directly involved in the Scissor Sisters' murder, his life kind of mirrors Linda's in a really eerie way. Wayne was violent from a young age. He fought everyone, classmates, his own parents, even broke his sister's jaw once. Then in 1995, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for killing a random man in a Dublin cemetery. Years later, in 2012, he was given a life sentence for another murder, this time alongside his nephew. It's kind of chilling, isn't it? That Linda and Wayne were once a couple, both scarred, both chaotic, and both ended up being involved in murder. It makes you wonder, if they stayed together, would they have committed a murder as a team? Would things have been worse? And one last thing before we go deeper into the case, something I found out while researching all this really surprised me. Ireland, despite its size, actually has one of the highest murder rates in Europe, averaging about 1 murder per week. That might not sound like a lot compared to bigger countries, but Ireland isn't big. So if you're listening from Ireland, I'm sorry if that stat startled you, but it just shows how real and close these kinds of stories can be. Now, let's talk about the younger sister, Charlotte Mulhall. Like Linda, Charlotte also struggled with addiction. Drugs, alcohol, it was a constant part of her life. She didn't have a steady job, and for a while, she turned to sex work just to make some extra money alongside her government benefits. She had a few minor run-ins with the law, things like criminal damage, but nothing serious. Nothing that would make you think she was capable of what she would eventually do. After leaving school, Charlotte lived a pretty unstable life. Sometimes, when she had a bit of money, she'd rent her own place. But when things got tight, which they often did, she'd move back into the family home. It was a cycle, in and out, up and down. Now, earlier, we mentioned how toxic the relationship was between their parents, John and Kathleen Mulhall. John was allegedly abusive toward Kathleen for years, and eventually she just couldn't take it anymore. But instead of leaving him outright, Kathleen made a different choice. In 2002, She met a man in a Dublin nightclub, a 35-year-old refugee from Kenya named Farah Swaleh Noor. And rather than ending things with her husband, Kathleen decided to bring Farah into their home, into the very same house where her husband and kids lived. Unsurprisingly, John wasn't having it. He took some of the children and moved out. He refused to stay under the same roof as his wife and her new boyfriend. After some time, Kathleen and Farah moved away together to a town in the south of Ireland, a place called Cork. Meanwhile, John and the remaining kids moved back into the family home in Dublin. But Kathleen's new relationship, it wasn't the escape she might have hoped for. Farah was violently abusive. He beat her regularly, broke both of her wrists, shattered her fingers, cracked her ribs. His abuse wasn't hidden, it was obvious, brutal, and constant. And tragically, Kathleen wasn't the only one. Farah had a long history of violence toward women, especially young girls. In fact, his record was horrific. Back in 1997, when he was 30 years old, he raped a 16-year-old mentally disabled Chinese girl. She became pregnant and gave birth to his son. And this wasn't a one-time incident. Farah had raped multiple underage girls. At least 2 others also had his children. He had at least 3 kids in total, all born out of assault. His criminal history was extensive. 8 convictions tied to sexual and physical assault, and somehow, despite all of this, he never spent a single day in prison. Not one. It's almost impossible to believe. Eventually, Kathleen and Farah moved back to Dublin. And when they did, Farah quickly became known again for his violent behavior. People saw the bruises, heard the yelling, but for whatever reason, it continued. And this is the world Linda and Charlotte were stepping back into. A household haunted by violence, drugs, and trauma about to tip over the edge. It was the 20th of March, 2005. Charlotte Mulhall had something to celebrate. She was turning 22 the next day, and she decided, as some people do, that she wanted to start the party a little early. That morning, still in their family home, she turned to her older sister Linda and asked her to join in. At first, Linda said no. She had just recently gotten custody of her 4 kids back. And that day, she was supposed to see her 11-year-old son. She was trying to stay sober, trying to rebuild a life, but Charlotte knew her sister well. She knew that Linda was still fragile and that way still easily swayed when it came to alcohol. And after a bit of coaxing, Linda gave in. It was 11 a.m. on a Sunday when the sisters cracked open a bottle of vodka and poured it into cheap bottles of Coke. And they didn't stop. About an hour or 2 into their drinking, Charlotte got a phone call from their mother, Kathleen. She was out in Dublin city center with her boyfriend, Farah Swaleh Noor, and she asked the girls to come join them to keep the celebrations going. Linda hesitated, but just like earlier, she gave in. She canceled plans with her son, got dressed, and headed out with Charlotte. At 1:15 in the afternoon, they caught a bus into the city. When they arrived, they found Kathleen and Farah already deep into their own bender. To be honest, the pair hadn't really stopped drinking since St. Patrick's Day 3 days earlier. They were on a downward slide, and today was just another leg of the fall. None of them had money to spare, so instead of going to a bar, they did what they could afford. They went to a corner shop, bought the biggest bottle of vodka they could find, 4 small bottles of Coke, and headed down to the pier. That's where they sat on a public bench, out in the open, pouring drinks and numbing themselves. At some point, Linda pulled out a small plastic bag filled with ecstasy pills. She and Charlotte each took 1, and when Kathleen noticed what they were doing, she didn't get angry. She didn't tell them to stop. Instead, she asked for 1 too. So now, under the pale Dublin sky, on a public pier where families were walking by, 3 women, 2 daughters, and their mother sat drunk and high on ecstasy, laughing, talking, drifting. It's surreal to picture. There's something so tragically broken about it, this raw, dysfunctional bond they had. No boundaries, no direction, just a spiral they all agreed to fall into together. But there was one person who didn't join in with the pills, Farah. The sisters didn't offer him any. They knew what he was like when he drank. They knew what he became when he took drugs. And they didn't want to go there. Farah's violence wasn't just occasional, it was part of who he was. With every drink, it grew worse. Add drugs into the mix, and he became someone truly dangerous. So the girls made a silent pact not to offer him anything more than alcohol, and he drank. Over the next few hours, the women each took 2 more pills. Linda, Charlotte, and Kathleen, drunk and increasingly detached from reality. Meanwhile, Farah just kept drinking. And with every gulp, he started to shift. First, he went quiet. Then he got irritable. Then angry. And before long, he was shouting in the middle of the street, snapping at them, raising his voice, drawing attention from passersby. He was ruining everything. Ruining the atmosphere. Ruining the high. And so someone, maybe Kathleen, maybe one of the sisters, suggested they leave the pier and go back to the apartment. The walk back to Kathleen and Farah's apartment was supposed to be short, just a few minutes from Dublin city center. The 4 of them, Kathleen, Farah, Linda, and Charlotte, moved through the street in uneasy silence. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. But then Farah suddenly stopped in his tracks. Across the street, just ahead of them, stood a small boy, no older than 5, with distinctly East Asian features. He was holding his mother's hand, looking up at the buildings like any curious child would. And in that moment, Farah broke. He froze. His eyes widened. And then, without any warning, he began crying like something inside him had snapped. Years ago, Farah had been involved with a Chinese woman under dark, unforgivable circumstances. A child had come from that, his child, but the woman had never let him near the boy. Rightfully so. He was never meant to be a father, and he had never seen that child, not even once. But now, staring at this little boy on the street, he convinced himself it was him, his son, his blood. His second chance, Farah rushed toward the child, arms wide, sobbing. He knelt down and wrapped the boy in his arms, holding him tightly, crying into his shoulder. "It's him," he cried. "That's my boy. It's my baby, my son." The boy immediately panicked. He didn't know this man. He started to cry, terrified, frozen in place. His mother was shouting, trying to pull him away. The boy sobbed louder. Farah held tighter. And in the middle of Dublin city center, in broad daylight, a full scene was unraveling. People began stopping, watching, whispering. Kathleen was mortified. She ran over and started yelling at Farah, telling him to stop, to let go of the child, to pull himself together. She was trying to calm the mother down at the same time, trying to explain, but there was no calming anything at that point. Farah didn't listen. He just kept sobbing, calling the boy his son. The mother was nearly in tears herself, demanding he let go, threatening to call the police. Then Linda and Charlotte turned around. They had been walking ahead, but the shouting behind them made them stop and turn. Linda immediately assumed Kathleen and Farah were fighting again. She had no idea what was happening, but she could tell the scene was spiraling. "What the fuck is going on now?" she snapped, her voice sharp and cold. Voices were overlapping Kathleen, shouting at Farah. Linda shouting at Kathleen. The child is screaming. The mother yelled for someone to get him away. Farah sobbing like he was reliving a memory that didn't belong to him anymore. The entire street was staring now. And without saying another word, Linda snapped. She rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off down the road toward the apartment. She didn't wait for anyone. She didn't look back. Once they got back to the apartment, Charlotte was able to calm Linda down pretty quickly. The earlier shouting match in the street was brushed aside like it never happened. By the time Kathleen and Farah made it to the flat, everything seemed fine again, like they had just pressed reset. So they did what they always did, picked up their drinks, kept using, and pretended things were normal. Charlotte threw on a Sean Paul album to lighten the mood, then headed into the kitchen with her mom to help make some drinks. As they were pouring them, Kathleen did something strange, something reckless. She took one of the ecstasy pills and crushed it, quietly mixing the powder into Farah's beer. She said she wanted to get him on the same level as the rest of the girls, as if that would somehow bring him closer or make the night easier. But she seemed to forget the one very big reason why he wasn't on drugs to begin with, because Farah was a violent man, and anything that made him more out of control was a serious risk. After that, they all went and sat together in the living room to carry on drinking. Farah and Linda ended up side by side on a cramped 2-seater sofa. Charlotte took the armchair next to them, and Kathleen sat a bit farther off, on another seat. For a little while, they just sat there, drinking and listening to music. But Farah, who was now mixing alcohol with the crushed pill he didn't know he'd consumed, started to change. He grew touchy. He began to stroke Linda's hair, put his arm around her shoulders, rested his hand on her thigh. Linda was clearly uncomfortable. This was her mom's boyfriend, and here he was, putting his hands on her. But she said nothing. Maybe out of fear, maybe shock, maybe because she just didn't want to cause another fight. She stayed still and hoped he'd stop. Charlotte, though, noticed. She saw what was happening and wasn't okay with it. She leaned over and told Farah firmly, "What are you doing? Get off my sister." He pulled back for a moment, but only for a moment. Not long after, he leaned in again. This time, he began whispering things into Linda's ear. She couldn't make much of it. His accent was thick, his speech was slurred, and his voice was barely more than a breath. But a few phrases still got through. He called her a creature of the night. And then, "You're just like your mummy." It was enough to sicken her. Disgusted, Linda tried to get up and walk away, but Farah wouldn't let go. He grabbed her arm and yanked her back down onto the couch, holding her in place. At that moment, Charlotte and Kathleen had stepped away into the kitchen to refill their drinks. But they heard Linda's voice raised in the living room, heard her yelling, trying to get away from him. They rushed back in, and there he was, still holding on to Linda, refusing to let her go. She was shouting, struggling, and now Charlotte and Kathleen were yelling at him too. But it didn't matter. He wasn't listening. Farah was locked in. He was determined. He had made up his mind. And then, suddenly, he stood up, dragging Linda up off the sofa with him. His hand still gripping her, he began pulling her across the room, straight toward the bedroom. And straight away, Kathleen knew exactly what his intentions were. And then everything escalated. Kathleen and Charlotte went into full panic. As Farah started dragging Linda toward the bedroom, they scrambled to stop him. They tried pulling at him, yelling, even physically grabbing onto Linda to pull her back, and it worked for a moment. Farah let go of Linda, but the second he did, he turned on Kathleen. Suddenly, without any warning, he started attacking her. Right there, in front of her two daughters, he began beating her, hitting her with so much rage, and force it sent shockwaves through the room. Then he shoved her, forcing her backward toward the bedroom. Only this time, he wasn't just being violent. He was making slashing motions across his throat with his hand, threatening her in the clearest, most terrifying way possible. Kathleen was terrified. She'd seen this rage before in bits, in bursts. But this time, it was different. It felt final. In that moment, her mind flashed back to a conversation she once had with one of Farah's ex-girlfriends. The woman had warned her that Farah wasn't going to change, that the violence would never stop, that if Kathleen didn't leave him, one day he was going to kill her. And right then, standing in her own apartment with this man dragging her toward the bedroom, everything hit her. She believed it, she saw it, she felt it, so she screamed. She turned to her daughters and shouted, "He's going to kill me!" And then she said something that would change everything. "Please kill him for me." That one sentence sent Charlotte and Linda into a blind panic. They froze, but only for a second. They knew there was no reasoning with Farah. He was far too drunk, too drugged up, and even if they tried to talk him down, it wouldn't have mattered. He wasn't listening. He was far too strong for them to overpower. And the way he was moving wild, erratic, violent made it clear that talking was no longer an option. So Charlotte ran. She bolted into the kitchen and opened a drawer. Inside, she grabbed a Stanley knife. She didn't pause. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight back to where Farah was holding on to their mother. Charlotte reached for the back of his head, yanked it backward, and drew the blade across his throat, slicing deep, creating a 4-inch wound. Farah staggered, stumbling down the hallway and into one of the bedrooms. He hit the floor hard, his head knocking against the side of the bed. But he wasn't dead. He tried to get back up. Charlotte panicked. He was still alive, still moving, still dangerous. So she went back in and slashed his throat again a second time. But even after that, he still wasn't dead. Somehow, he was still alive after all of it. The blow to the head, 2 deep cuts to the neck, and now Linda was panicking too. She ran into the kitchen, grabbed the first thing she could find, a hammer. Without thinking, she ran into the bedroom and jumped in to help. She raised the hammer and brought it down on Farah's head with everything she had, again and again. She later said she couldn't even remember how many times she hit him, she just kept going. Her entire body was behind every blow. And while all of this was happening, while Charlotte was slashing and Linda was swinging a hammer at their mother's boyfriend Kathleen, she was sitting in the living room, watching television, drinking her beer, like nothing was happening just a few feet away. Kathleen later insisted that she never actually witnessed the murder. According to her, her daughter stopped her from going into the bedroom. They physically held her back from seeing what was happening. She said she didn't see a thing. But inside that room, things had already spiraled far beyond reason. Charlotte and Linda were no longer thinking clearly. All sense of logic, all grip on reality had disappeared. The adrenaline had completely taken over. Farrah was already injured badly, but that didn't stop them. Charlotte rushed back into the kitchen. She opened another drawer, reached in, and grabbed a second knife. This one was a bread knife. Then she went straight back into the bedroom and began stabbing him. Over and over again. She stabbed him 27 times in total, each thrust driven by pure panic and chaos. Meanwhile, Linda kept using the hammer. She stood over Farrah's body, swinging with all her strength, again and again, hitting him in the head repeatedly. The brutality of it all was staggering. Some of the stab wounds were so deep and forceful that they punctured one of Faraz's lungs. The knife tore through his stomach, his liver, even one of his kidneys was completely severed. The room was a scene of utter destruction. Eventually, when it became clear that Farah wasn't moving anymore, when there was no breath, no twitch, nothing, the girls finally stopped. Their hands, their clothes, the floor, everything was covered in blood. They stood there, frozen. That's when reality started to creep in. They had just killed someone. Immediately, panic set in. Linda collapsed. The two girls cried, clung to each other, holding on like they were trying to wake themselves from a nightmare. It was as if they were entirely different people, now shaken, terrified, overwhelmed. Still covered in blood, the sisters held hands and slowly walked back into the living room. They told their mother everything. They told her exactly what they had done to her boyfriend in the bedroom. And as soon as Kathleen saw the blood on them, saw the panic in their faces, it finally hit her too. The weight of it all. She snapped. She began screaming at them. Not crying, not comforting, just screaming, telling them to get rid of the body. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Everything moved quickly after that. The girls dragged Farah's limp, blood-soaked body into the bathroom. That's when the next, even darker part of the night began. Linda later said that it was Charlotte who spoke first, who said the words no one ever wants to hear. "We're gonna have to cut him up." But Charlotte's version is different. She claimed it wasn't her idea at all, that it was actually Kathleen, their own mother, who told them to do it. Whoever said it, the decision had been made. Farah was going to be dismembered. Linda and Charlotte both took part. And through it all, it was obvious who was holding it together and who wasn't. Linda was falling apart. She sat on the toilet, covered in blood, crying, screaming, totally broken by what was happening. Charlotte, on the other hand, stayed much more composed. She was the one who seemed to realize there were things that needed to be done, and so she just did them. But even then, the only tools they had to carry out something so horrific were pitiful, barely usable. All they had was a 9-inch bread knife, already very blunt, and a tiny cheap Stanley knife. Charlotte started with his right leg. Using one of the knives, she began cutting just above the knee slowly, steadily pushing through muscle, skin, and sinew until she reached the bone. When the knife could go no further, she picked up the hammer and used it to break through the bone, smashing it with enough force to snap it apart. After that, she continued with the knife, slicing through the rest of the leg until it came free. They did the exact same thing on the other leg. Each limb was separated into two parts, from above the knee to below, and then from the hip down to the knee. By the time they finished both legs, they had 4 separate pieces of Farah's lower body, and they didn't know where else to put them, so they just tossed them into the bathtub. That became their system. Every time they removed another body part, they would throw it into the bath just to keep it out of the way for now. It was gruesome, detached, almost mechanical, and they just kept going. For reasons that remain unclear, they suddenly made a large, deep cut into his stomach, a huge open gash. They didn't remove any organs intentionally, but some things began to spill out naturally from the wound. It wasn't planned. No one really knows why they did that. Maybe it was just chaos. Maybe it was rage. At one point during all of this, Linda remembered something. Something Kathleen had told her long ago, that Farah had raped her not once, but multiple times over the course of their relationship. That memory hit her hard. Fueled by anger, Linda pulled off Farah's underwear. Then she took a knife and cut off his penis. And as she did it, she said, "Now you'll never rape my mom again." By the time they finished after nearly 5 hours of this, Farah's body had been reduced to 9 pieces. Both arms, both legs below the knee, both upper legs from hip to knee, his torso, his penis, and finally, his head. And the beheading, according to both girls, was the worst part. They didn't have proper tools. They had 2 knives, one of them small, the other dull. They began by slicing through the neck bit by bit, slowly cutting through layers of tissue and muscle. When they reached the spine, they had to bring out the hammer again, using it to break through the vertebrae and dislodge the skull from the spine. Then they used the knife again to finish separating the remaining flesh at the neck. Once it was done, they packed the body parts into bin liners, large black trash bags. They tried to think through what they were going to do next. The bin collection wasn't coming for another 5 days, and there was no way they could keep a decomposing corpse in the apartment for that long. So they made a plan. Kathleen went into the bedroom and pulled out some of Farah's old gym bags. Together, the girls stuffed his remains into 3 separate bags, his own gym bags, each packed with parts of the man they had killed. Then they turned to the next job, cleaning. They started with the bathroom, and it was horrific. The walls, the ceiling, the floors, every surface was soaked in blood. It wasn't just messy, it was saturated. But somehow, the girls managed to clean everything. They scrubbed and bleached every inch of that room. According to police, their cleanup job was so thorough that it didn't even look like a crime had taken place there. When investigators came to search the flat later, they actually inspected the bathroom 3 different times, and on the first 2 visits, they were completely convinced the murder couldn't have happened there. It was just too clean. Now, I want to be honest, the next part of the story is based on scattered reports and can't be confirmed with 100% certainty. So take it with a grain of salt. But according to some sources, while the cleanup was still ongoing, while they were scrubbing blood off the tiles and trying to figure out what to do next, Linda made a phone call. She called her father, John. She didn't explain. She didn't say anything about what had just happened. She just told him, "Come to my mom's flat." So John, Linda, and Charlotte's father supposedly came to Kathleen's flat without having any idea why he'd been called. Linda had sounded panicked on the phone, and that alone was enough to make him rush over. But when he walked through the door and saw what had happened, when he realized that his daughters had just killed someone, he was horrified. He didn't say anything, he just turned around and walked straight back out. Later, the sisters would claim that John did come back, that after stepping away and letting it all sink in, he returned to the flat. They said that, despite what had happened, he couldn't abandon them. That he helped with the cleanup, helped erase what they'd done, but none of that has ever been confirmed. And as you'll find out later, there's a reason that doubt remains. Officially, John always denied having anything to do with the murder or the cleanup. The next morning, around 7 a.m., after the night of blood and panic, the 3 women, Kathleen, Linda, and Charlotte, set out to dispose of Farah's body. By then, everything had been cleaned, cut, and packed. Linda and Charlotte each carried a gym bag. Linda's held Farah's arms and some of his clothing. Charlotte's bag carried his torso and internal organs. It was still early, the city was just beginning to wake up, and as they walked down the street, no one gave them a second look. People passed them casually, having no idea what the bags held. It was Charlotte's birthday, and the 3 of them looked completely normal, like any group of women heading to the gym at dawn. They made their way to the Royal Canal. There was a bridge overhead, offering some cover, some privacy. That's where they stopped. And one by one, they began dropping the bin bags into the water, waiting, watching, making sure they sank. Right above them, people were walking across the bridge, totally unaware that just underneath their feet, someone's body was being disposed of piece by piece. It took multiple trips, back and forth from the flat to the canal. But eventually, they managed to get rid of nearly everything. Everything except the head and the penis. They knew those 2 parts had to be handled differently, especially the head. It could be used to identify Farah through dental records. And if anything had to disappear permanently, it was that. So the three women placed Farah's head into a backpack. Along with it, they packed the murder weapons, the hammer, the knives, and then they boarded a bus headed to a nearby town called Talat. That morning, they walked through a crowded shopping center, carrying a severed head and blood-stained weapons inside a bag, and no one suspected a thing. They kept walking until they reached a public park called Tai Men North Park, and that's where the tension boiled over. The three women started arguing about where to put the head. Should they throw it in the water? Should they bury it? Should they just dump it somewhere and run? The argument kept going in circles, voices rising, panic building, and eventually, Kathleen couldn't take it anymore. She dropped to her knees under a park bench and started digging with her bare hands. She didn't dig deep. They didn't really try to hide it properly. They placed Farah's head in the shallow hole, covered it quickly, and left. There was still a visible mound of disturbed earth beneath the bench, but they didn't care. Not in that moment. They tossed the murder weapons into a nearby pond in the same park, and then they just went home. In the days that followed, all three women went on a massive drug and alcohol binge. They were trying to forget, to drown it all out, to numb everything, but Linda, she was struggling the most. From the very beginning, she had been falling apart, shaking, crying, screaming. During the dismemberment, she'd barely held it together. And now, after it was all done, after the murder and the cover-up and the dumping, Linda completely broke down. She was taking it the hardest out of all three women. 10 days after the murder on the 30th of March, 2005 something surfaced. A human leg was found floating in the Royal Canal, still wearing a sock. Since the night of the murder, all three women had been regularly walking down to that canal, not for reflection or guilt, but to check, to make sure nothing had floated up, to keep an eye on the water, just in case. And by chance or by karma, they happened to be taking one of these checkup walks at the exact moment police were pulling that leg out of the water. A press crew was on the scene too, filming as police fished the remains from the canal. They caught footage of the three women watching from nearby, looking down into the water. The news team assumed they were just shocked bystanders, horrified citizens witnessing a gruesome discovery. But in reality, the cameras were capturing the actual killers. They were standing just feet from the remains, watching. As soon as that leg was recovered, divers were called in to search for more. One by one, over the following days, the police recovered most of the body. Everything except for the head and the penis. And once that discovery was public, Linda panicked. She was terrified that police would find the head they'd buried in Tai Men North Park. So, in another wave of desperation, she went back. She unburied the head herself. And this time, she did something even more disturbing. She brought her 11-year-old son's school bag with her, and into that school bag, she placed the severed head. She carried it, alone, to a different park. There, she supposedly drank a full bottle of vodka by herself. At some point, she picked up a hammer again and hit the head even more, maybe trying to further damage it, or maybe to punish it. She then reburied it deeper this time. Witnesses later said she was so intoxicated while doing it that she began talking to the head, whispering apologies, regrets, saying things like, "I'm sorry, it should have been my ma, not you." Meanwhile, police were still trying to identify the body. Without a head, it was nearly impossible. They had no dental records to match, no visual identification. So they released a statement saying the remains belonged to a white male. And here's where things got confusing. Farah Swaleh Noor was from Africa. He was a black man. But when police examined the body, they noticed that the parts that had been exposed to the water and the sun were extremely pale, almost white, while the parts that had been protected by clothing still had their original dark pigmentation. It baffled investigators at first, but the explanation seemed to lie in the water. Somehow, being submerged for so long had stripped the exposed areas of his skin of their pigmentation. The sun, the water, the decomposition, it had literally bleached parts of his body white. One investigator said his skin was as pale as the drawers behind them, stark, unnatural. But beneath the clothing, the real skin tone remained. Eventually, they confirmed that this was indeed Farah. His body showed a total of 27 stab wounds, scattered across the various limbs and sections that had been recovered. But there was something else. There were no defensive wounds. That meant Farah had never fought back. He never had a chance to. He didn't block, didn't resist. It was over before he could even process what was happening. At first, because of the missing head and genitals, police considered the possibility of a ritualistic killing. It wasn't a far stretch, especially given the state of the body. And strangely enough, there had recently been another case that raised similar questions. Not long before Farah's remains were discovered, another body had washed up in London further down the river, and that one had already been confirmed as a ritual killing. That case was known as the Torso in the Thames. It involved the body of a young African boy, believed to be around 8 or 9 years old, whose torso was found along the riverbank. No other body parts were ever recovered. He was never identified. No family ever came forward, and there was no real trace of where he came from or what happened to him. It was just confirmed to have been a ritual killing. After the discovery of the dismembered body, Irish police were left with more questions than answers. The missing head and genitals had pushed the case into disturbing territory, and investigators began to wonder, could this be some kind of ritual killing? So, they reached out to African authorities. In certain regions of Africa, ritual killings are more commonly reported, and Irish police hoped that by consulting with them, they might gain insight, maybe even a lead. Who could have done this? Why was the body left like that? But before those conversations could really get underway, before the inquiry reached across borders, something unexpected happened. The body was identified. In an effort to find out who the victim was, police had released images of the clothing that had been found on the body parts. Just the garments, nothing graphic, in hopes that someone might recognize them. And someone did. One of Farah Suela Noor's friends saw the poster. He hadn't heard from Farah in weeks, maybe months. But he recognized that shirt instantly. It was the one Farah had been wearing the last time he saw him, on the very day he was murdered. More than 100 days after that leg was pulled from the canal, the body was officially identified as Farah Suela Noor. With the name finally attached to the remains, police looked into Farah's background. Their system showed he had 3 children, so they reached out to one of the mothers and asked if they could collect DNA just to confirm the identification beyond doubt. They collected a sample from Farah's son and also from his mother. When the lab results came back, they showed that the son's DNA was a perfect 50-50th match, half from his mother, half from the body found in the canal. It was undeniable. That body was Farah. Now, the friend who had recognized the shirt, the one who saw Farah that day, became a central figure in the investigation. He told police everything he knew. He'd seen Farah on the day of the murder. He'd seen him with Kathleen Mulhall and with her 2 daughters. He explained that Farah could be volatile, that he had a history of being aggressive. That made police even more suspicious, especially of Kathleen. They began pushing to search her flat, but by the time they caught up to her, she'd already moved out of the flat where she and Farah had lived. That too raised red flags. Why would she move so soon after his disappearance? But it was what Kathleen had done weeks earlier that would change the entire case. Sometime before the body was identified, Kathleen had gone to visit 2 of her sons, John and James Mulhall, who were both in prison at the time. During that visit, she told them everything. She told them that their sisters, Charlotte and Linda, had killed her boyfriend. She told them about the fight, about the dismemberment, and about the cleanup. She even admitted she was there, though she made sure to say she wasn't involved. That while it all happened, she was sitting in the living room, drinking vodka and Coke, watching television. She didn't try to hide the fact that she'd seen the aftermath. She just emphasized that she hadn't taken part. At first, John and James kept it to themselves. They didn't tell a soul. Why would they? Why would anyone want to turn in their own sisters? But as time passed, the pressure began to build. They saw the police hovering around their mother, asking questions, circling closer. And all the while, their sisters, the ones who had actually committed the murder, said nothing. They were letting Kathleen shoulder the blame, letting suspicion fall on her, even though they knew she wasn't the one who had done it. And to John and James, that was too much. They believed their mother had made mistakes, sure, but Letting her take the fall for a murder she didn't commit, that was unforgivable. So they went to the police. The brothers told investigators everything what Kathleen had said during that prison visit, and most importantly, where the murder had taken place. And that was a game changer. Now the police had a location. They went straight to the old flat that Kathleen and Farah had once shared. It had new tenants living there, but the layout was the same. And when officers entered the bedroom, something stood out immediately. A huge section of carpet was missing. That alone was enough to trigger alarms. Investigators called in the forensics team to carry out a full search of the flat walls, floors, every possible surface looking for blood spatter or any trace of what had happened there. But unfortunately, they were running out of luck. Since Kathleen had moved out, several other tenants had lived there. The place had been completely repainted. The furniture was new. The layout was slightly changed. Every possible piece of physical evidence had been either removed or covered up. So even though they knew they were in the right place, the chances of finding any kind of blood spotting on the walls or anything like that was very, very low. At first, forensic investigators came up empty. They scoured the flat floors, walls, bathroom tiles, furniture, but they couldn't find a single trace of blood. No DNA, no tissue, nothing to indicate that a murder had taken place there. It was frustrating. The leads seemed solid, especially with what John and James had told them, but physically, there was nothing to prove it. Still, the police weren't giving up. They believed the Mulhall brothers had no reason to lie. There was nothing for them to gain by turning in their own family. Plus, detectives had always been suspicious of Kathleen Mulhall to begin with, so they escalated. They brought in more advanced forensic technology, newer equipment, more sensitive testing, and finally, it paid off. Tiny blood spots, microscopic traces were found scattered across the apartment. They were small, but they were there. On surfaces, on corners, on places you wouldn't notice with the naked eye. And that was all police needed. The story was real. The flat had without question been the site of a murder. Armed with this evidence and the statement from John and James, police moved in to question Linda and Charlotte. When they went to find Linda, they realized something immediately. She wasn't doing well. Not mentally, not physically. She looked completely broken. Since the murder, Linda had spiraled. She wasn't eating, barely sleeping, constantly high, constantly drunk. Her life had deteriorated into a fog of substance abuse and regret. She'd even attempted suicide. The weight of what she had done and what she had helped cover up was clearly crushing her. And eventually, it became too much. During questioning, Linda couldn't hold it in anymore. She broke down and confessed everything. From Farah's threats and the attempted rape, to the murder, to the dismemberment, to the disposal. She told the entire story from beginning to end, in painful, vivid detail. Police described her confession as extremely emotional, and it showed. You could tell it had been eating her alive for over a year. Every word she spoke, every memory she shared, it was like she was finally letting go of something that had been poisoning her. And when it was over, the detective said it was like a weight had lifted off her shoulders. She looked lighter, still devastated, but relieved, like she could finally breathe again. With that, police turned to Charlotte. They arrested her based on Linda's confession. But when they questioned her, Charlotte denied everything. She said Linda was lying, that their mother, Kathleen, was the one who killed Farah. She claimed she and Linda had nothing to do with it and that Kathleen had roped them in afterward. It was clear she was trying to protect herself and maybe even protect her sister. In her mind, she was choosing loyalty to Linda over loyalty to their mother. But the police weren't convinced, not even close. Linda's confession had been too raw, too consistent, too emotionally real. And when Charlotte realized that the detectives weren't buying her version of events, that they fully believed Linda and weren't going to change their minds, she changed her approach. Charlotte eventually gave in and agreed with Linda's version of the story. Meanwhile, Kathleen had cut off all contact with her daughters after the body had been found. No phone calls, no letters, nothing. After pushing Linda and Charlotte into helping her cover up a murder, she had turned her back on them entirely. And not only that, Kathleen fled the country. She moved to England, likely hoping that if she left Ireland behind, she could avoid prosecution altogether. Put distance between herself and the crime, but it was too late. Authorities already had enough. Linda and Charlotte Mulhall were both officially charged with murder, and the trial began in October of 2006. Both Charlotte and Linda Mulhall entered the courtroom and pled not guilty to murder. But after hearing all the evidence, the jury saw things differently. Charlotte, now 23 years old, was found guilty of murder. The court sentenced her to life in prison. Linda, however, wasn't found guilty of murder. Instead, the jury convicted her of manslaughter on the grounds that she had been provoked. They believed that Linda had been pushed into a different mental state that night, not only by the ecstasy and alcohol, but by the very real fear of what Farrah might have done to her. It's true that Farrah didn't outright say he was going to rape her. He didn't speak the words, but the situation, his behavior, the way he grabbed her, dragged her, whispered threats. The intent was clear to everyone in that room. And when you look at how Linda behaved after the murder, the guilt, the collapse, the crying, the suicide attempt, it painted a picture of someone completely shattered. The jury concluded that Linda was not in her right mind when she joined in the attack, that she had been pushed to that breaking point, provoked into something she would never have done otherwise. Whether you agree with that or not is your call. Everyone's entitled to their own view of what provocation means in a situation like this. But the jury saw something in her. Something that made them believe her actions came from a place of fear, not malice. So instead of life, Linda received 15 years in prison. Then, in 2008, something unexpected happened. Kathleen Mulhall, who had fled to England after the murder, voluntarily returned to Ireland. When she did, she was arrested and charged with several offenses, including providing false information to police and withholding information about a murder. She didn't get charged for the murder itself, but for everything else, the silence, the lies, the refusal to help. In May of 2009, Kathleen was sentenced to 5 years in prison. She has since been released, but not everyone in the family survived the aftermath. In December 2005, after learning that both of his daughters had been officially charged with murder, John Mulhall, their father, couldn't cope. The guilt, the shame, the heartbreak, it crushed him. He wrote a suicide note on the back of a 50-pound note, saying that he couldn't live knowing what his daughters had done, that they had turned out this way. He walked into a local park and hung himself. To this day, John has never been officially linked to the murder or the cleanup. There are only scattered reports, whispers from unconfirmed sources suggesting that he may have helped in some way, but nothing was ever proven. And Linda and Charlotte never said anything to confirm or deny his involvement. And then there's the part of the story that still remains unsolved. Farrah's head and his genitals were never recovered. The women never admitted where they were buried or if they were moved again. Police searched parks, fields, and rivers. Nothing. And so those have never been found still to this day. In 2008, a disturbing image leaked from inside one of Ireland's prisons. The photo showed Charlotte Mulhall behind bars, holding a knife to the neck of a male inmate. No one knows exactly how the photo was taken or how it got out, but once it reached the press, it became headline news. It caused massive public outrage and forced a nationwide response. Security measures were immediately tightened in prisons across Ireland. Charlotte was swiftly transferred to a different facility, one with much higher security, and she was separated from the inmate in the photo. It was clear that, even in custody, Charlotte remained volatile. Then, in January of 2018, Linda Mulhall was released from prison. She had served 13 years of her original 15-year sentence and walked free at the age of 42. Where is she now? No one really knows for sure. We know she's living somewhere in Dublin, but beyond that, everything's a mystery. Whether she's working, whether she changed her name, it's all unclear. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe after everything, she just wanted to disappear from the public eye and try to start over quietly. And here's one last strange detail to close this out. While both sisters were incarcerated in separate prisons, it came out that each of them had entered romantic relationships with prison guards. Both of them. Different prisons, different guards. Which, considering everything, I thought it was kind of weird.